I have the great pleasure to introduce you to Emily Moyer Guse, who is our speaker today and the inaugural speaker for this year in the health communication group here at the University of Pennsylvania. Now, Emily has not been invited here because of her roots at Michigan State University, which some of us share. She has not been invited here because she is the advisee of Robin Nabby, who is an advisee of somebody near and dear to me. Those are not the reasons that she has been invited here. She has been invited here because of her work in the study of narrative, which is a topic that many of us have been interested in and continue to be interested in. She's been invited here because of the quality of the work in that area, in particular a piece in communication theory, which was the most cited piece in communication theory in 2010, also on a theory of narrative. She's been invited here because the work that she's done has been widely published in top-notch journals in the field in communication research and health communication, in the Journal of Communication, in media psychology, and in other outlets that don't need to be named in detail. Emily's work is, I think, the kind of work that has been groundbreaking and consistent and paradigmatic in the studies that she's conducted, and it's the kind of work that I think we all aspire to for someone so young. And so we will ask you to join me in welcoming her here to the Annenberg School. Emily.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that very kind introduction, and thank you all for being here today. I am so happy to be here to talk with you. I'm really honored to have been invited to speak with you as part of this series, and I'm really excited about it. So what I hoped to talk about today is some of my work in narrative persuasion, and as you can see in particular, thinking about how we engage with narratives, how we engage with stories and the characters within those stories, and the ways in which that leads to persuasive outcomes, with a particular emphasis on kind of how it can allow us to overcome various types of resistance to persuasion. And I'll talk about that in a couple of different health-related topic areas today. So I'll talk about a few different, several different studies. And with those, I want to address a couple of big picture kind of questions about narrative persuasion and how it works. In particular, the ways in which narrative persuasion is unique or distinct from other types of more explicit or traditional types of persuasion. So questions surrounding, hey, is this a more effective strategy? Is it that it's more effective in certain contexts, for certain audiences, for certain topics? So I'll look at that. And then what a lot of my work has been focused on is understanding how does it work? How is it that we process narratives in unique ways? What are the mechanisms that explain narrative persuasion in terms of resistance to persuasion? And then throughout a couple of those studies and towards the end of the talk, I'll also say a little bit about interpersonal discussion, specifically with respect to how we talk about narratives. How do we talk about an entertainment TV show that might have an embedded storyline about a particular health topic? And how does that influence the way in which we are persuaded by that narrative as well? But first things first, just defining narrative persuasion. What is it? And what is a narrative? These are important questions certainly to deal with. And when we look at narrative persuasion at the most basic level, we're talking about, of course, using stories to persuade rather than using carefully constructed arguments. We're talking about telling a story. And this idea of telling a story to convey a message is in no way a new idea. Although we've seen an increase in the study of narrative persuasion over recent decades, it's certainly an old notion. We can think about Aesop's fables, right? Things like the story of the boy who cried wolf. And these are the sorts of stories that we might tell to children to teach various lessons or to persuade particular behaviors. In that case, tell the truth. And so we can look at those older examples, and certainly in the context that many of you are interested in particular smoking prevention-related behaviors, tobacco. Narrative persuasion is highly relevant in that context as well, especially as a means perhaps to reach adolescents who consume a lot of entertainment media or who might be prone to reactance and things like that. And so we can look at narrative persuasion in popular entertainment media as well. And there has been, we see this in a number of different topics. There are episodes of the popular show Glee that address different issues that are relevant to young people. The image behind me is one of a storyline that deals with bullying and bullying related to sexual orientation. And so through that story, we see sort of the consequences for both the victim and the aggressor of this sort of bullying. And there are some messages there. There's not been a lot that really has looked at smoking or tobacco-related behaviors in entertainment narrative messages, in part perhaps because we don't see that topic as frequently as some of the other topics that are examined a lot, sexual health, alcohol, things like that. There seems to be less examples of this sort of message in entertainment media. And the work that I understand some of you are working on will be able to answer that question more clearly for us, perhaps down the road. This is one example of an episode of the show Clueless, which was based on the movie by the same name and was a TV show that aired throughout the 1990s. And there was a storyline in that program about smoking. And this storyline has been evaluated in one study, actually. And basically, the narrative was designed to communicate the message that smoking's not cool, smoking is unappealing, and throughout that narrative, they were able to demonstrate that that this particular show was relatively effective at communicating that message to viewers through a lab study that they did with adolescents. However, what they found was that it sort of backfired for smokers. So they believe that the reason why that was that some of the smokers in the sample actually identified with the smoking character, who was also an attractive character. And so they identified with him and kind of interpreted the message in a different way, in a way that was counter to the persuasive outcomes. And I mention that because that's one of the really critical things about understanding narrative persuasion, is that in some ways the strength of narrative persuasion is also the potential weakness, which is the strength is it's a more subtle form of persuasion. It doesn't necessarily hit you over the head with the fact that you're being persuaded, and that has implications for things like reactance. But also, in being more subtle, it's also more open for interpretation, which means that there are times when these kinds of messages can backfire as well. Okay, so why isolate narrative message processing? Why think about it in a separate category from just persuasion in general? That has to do with the structure of a narrative, the narrative story structure. And when I talk about and think about narratives, I think about narratives existing on a continuum. So I can look at a given message as having more or less narrative properties. I like to think about it that way, more so than something either is or is not a narrative. That categorization is at times difficult, but we can think about the extent to which something uses a story format, and when it uses a story format, that means it takes place in some particular setting. There are characters. Those characters engage in some events that are sequentially related in terms of cause and effect. There's generally some sort of conflict and resolution. And so that structure is a unique aspect of a narrative persuasion context, as well as the characters within the story, and the way in which we're invited to identify or become engaged with those characters in some way. And we can think about that engagement in different ways, whether it's identification or parasocial relationships, but they all have important properties that have to do with us becoming involved in the story in some way. And again, depending on who you relate to in a story, the smoker character or the girl who's repulsed by the smoker, depending on how you engage with that story and identify or take the perspective of one character versus another, that has implications for the meaning that you construct and ultimately persuasive outcomes. So in terms of theory, as I said, I'm interested in this from the perspective of resistance to persuasion and how narratives might help to overcome some of those traditional forms of resistance to persuasion. And so Green and Brock, as well as Slater and Rauner, have talked about that in terms of the ability of narratives to reduce counter-arguing through engagement with the text, through transportation, or essentially the idea of becoming swept up into the story, such that I forget about my own perspective, I sort of forget about the world around me, and I'm along for the ride. And that's really important part of the piece. And then in the com theory piece that I wrote, I talked about some of the other forms of resistance to persuasion that this sort of engagement with a narrative might also work to reduce. Some of those, this is what that model looks like, and I won't spend time talking about all the pieces of this model right now, but just to highlight some of the main points that I will touch on today is the idea of psychological reactance. And so psychological reactance being the notion that when we perceive a threat to our freedoms, that we react to that to try to reestablish those freedoms. So oftentimes a persuasive message can be construed as such a threat. And so to the extent that a narrative story structure reduces perceptions of persuasive intent or perceptions of an explicit persuasive appeal, we may see that it reduces psychological reactance. Similarly, having that relationship with a character, whether I like the character or feel a parasocial relationship with the character, that may reduce this sort of reactance. Another aspect of this that I'll touch on today has to do with perceived vulnerability to some threat. So if I engage in some risky behavior, what's the likelihood that I will encounter a negative consequence? And whether we're thinking about smoking behavior or risky sexual behavior or any sort of risk behavior, this is oftentimes a challenge, is how do you get people to feel as though they really are at risk or they really are vulnerable to a particular threat? And the notion of identification with a character, that if I vicariously experience the consequences along with a character, that might bring that vulnerability to life or allow me to experience it in a way that I otherwise may not do. So one of the studies that I'll talk about today tests a portion of that model that I was just talking about, and was designed to really look at that question of how do these messages work? Can we document that these features of entertainment narratives actually do reduce resistance in the ways specified by the model? And in this study, I'll look at that in the context of unintended teen pregnancy. So this particular study was a pretty straightforward experiment that looked at two message conditions. Participants were college students, and they were randomly assigned to watch either a narrative version of a story that demonstrates the sort of negative consequences of an unintended teen pregnancy, or they watched I have non-narrative, sort of in quotes here to reflect my view of narrative existing sort of on a continuum, but maybe better to say a less narrative-based message condition, which was more of a educational sort of persuasive message that was designed with the national campaign as well as Channel 1 News to be viewed in schools kind of in a health class. So it's a message that's more explicit in its persuasive intent that these are the consequences of teen pregnancy, and this is something to be avoided. And so we wanted to look at the relative effects of these two different programs, but more importantly, the process by which these effects may take place. A couple of things just to kind of demonstrate this idea that narratives, do have unique properties about them. We find that the narrative condition was associated with greater perceived similarity and identification with the characters. So we can see that those characters were drawing in or creating that involvement more so than the non-narrative condition, which featured some real teenagers that had experienced teen pregnancy. Transportation was higher, although only marginally. So perceived persuasive intent was substantially lower in the narrative condition relative to the non-narrative condition, and reactance was also lower in the narrative condition. So kind of expected findings, but demonstrating some of those notions about the way in which the story structure impacts how we react to the content. And then in terms of overall effects on outcomes, what we found was that the narrative message was more effective for females. And so the narrative message and not the narrative message relative to the non-narrative message increased intentions to engage in safe sex at the immediate post-test, and that effect persisted 2 weeks later at a delayed post-test. But the same was not true for males in the sample. And in fact, for males in the sample, we actually saw a boomerang effect, such that for those in the narrative condition, their intentions to engage in safe sex went down at the post-test, and that effect persisted 2 weeks later at the delayed post-test as well. The same was not true in the non-narrative condition. So this is not just something about how men were reacting to this topic in general or persuasion in general, but it was unique to this particular message, this narrative. Again, I think underscoring the importance of considering the way in which these narrative messages can be interpreted in different ways by different segments of an audience, in this case by gender, in the previous example in terms of by status as a smoker or non-smoker. Why did this happen? Some post hoc analyses revealed it seems as though this was related to simply them not liking this program. They didn't like the show. They didn't like the characters. They didn't buy it. The narrative didn't ring true for them. And so there were a lot of negative reactions to the program in that way. Reactance was slightly higher among men than women, but not significantly so. So I don't think it can be attributed, just to that. But primarily in terms of just not liking the narrative and not becoming engaged with the narrative in the way that we would have expected. So looking at these narrative effects, when we see them, and we did find that the narrative was more persuasive for the females in the sample, how does this work? Can we look at the mechanisms of narrative persuasion and gain some understanding about the unique ways in which we may, audiences may process narratives? And a couple of things to highlight about this. We do see that reactance is operating in the way that we might expect, such that parasocial relationship with the characters reduces reactance, such that perceived persuasive intent is associated with greater reactance. And so those results are to be expected. I think the most interesting results in this particular study, though, had to do with vulnerability. And what we found was that we expected that identification would lead to greater perceived vulnerability. Again, that idea, here identification means taking on the perspective of the character, seeing the world through his or her eyes, feeling what she feels, taking on those motivations, those negative consequences. We expected that identification would increase perceived vulnerability at the post-test. This relationship was not significant. At the post-test, we included a measure of perceived vulnerability at the delayed post-test 2 weeks later and find that this relationship appears. So identification with the character while viewing predicts perceived vulnerability 2 weeks later, which then is related to intentions. And so this finding is interesting because it suggests that something about that vicarious experience while viewing has some sort of, it suggests that there's some amount of rumination or thinking about the message in that interim. It's also really interesting because it is consistent with a growing body of evidence that shows an increase in narrative effects over time. So some of my other work and other folks' work has shown that as well. And so this sheds some light on perhaps what one of those mechanisms might be, that it might be something about identification with the characters is leading to some personalization or rumination about the story as it relates to me in my own life over time. So looking at that study, we can see a couple of main conclusions. On the one hand, the narrative messages certainly worked differently for different segments of the audience. So we see that this particular narrative was really effective for females, backfired for males. And we see this delayed effect, which, as I said, is consistent with some past work on narrative persuasion. This issue of different audience members responding differently is also a consistent effect, and one that I've thought a lot about in my research in terms of what what opportunities are there to be able to, you know, if you're a message designer and you want to use narrative persuasion, what tools are available to try to control or steer the way in which people will interpret the message so that you can reduce some of these boomerang effects. And so to look at that, I want to talk about a second study, and one that is in a different context, in the context of organ donation. But again, looking at identification and, in this case, using an explicit persuasive appeal combined with a narrative to try to look at how that might be able to highlight or underscore certain components of the underlying persuasive message. Okay. So in this particular study, what we were interested in was the use of a PSA or an epilogue or some sort of explicit appeal that we often see combined with narrative messages. And this is something in practice that we see a fair amount. So in terms of formal entertainment education interventions internationally, we might see a very formal epilogue, a longer epilogue at the conclusion of the program. Here in the US, we might see a quick PSA where a main character sort of turns to the audience and directly addresses the topic that was just covered, you know, whether it's drinking and driving or sexual assault or something like that, makes a direct appeal to the audience. But these kinds of explicit appeals are combined with narrative messages with some regularity. And there's sort of competing hypotheses about how this might work. And we don't know a whole lot about that. And so this study was one of a series of studies that I've done to try to look at that, to try to look at the effect of these explicit appeals. And the competing hypotheses most generally are that, you know, on the one hand, we might expect that an explicit appeal, a PSA or something like that, could clarify and reinforce the persuasive message, underscore the intended, what that intended message was. On the other hand, to the extent that making, obscuring persuasive intent is critical to a narrative persuasion strategy, it might also kind of bring that back to the foreground. And in doing that, it could arouse reactance or disrupt transportation and somehow lead to generating counter-arguments, maybe even counter-arguments after the fact. And so those are sort of the two ways of looking at this. An important piece to understand about it, too, is the fact that these explicit persuasive appeals are generally delivered by a main character. And so it's presumably going to be a liked character or a character with whom viewers may have just finished identifying with in the context of the story. And so this may offset some of these concerns here about arousing reactance and those kinds of things. So this is what we set out to look at in this particular study, is when we have one of these explicit persuasive appeals at the end of a TV show, in this case about organ donation, will that lead to greater awareness of persuasive intent? Will it lead to more reactance or counter-arguing? Will it influence attitudes toward organ donation above and beyond the narrative itself? And then we were also interested in whether it would influence discussion with family. In this case, because of the topic of organ donation, the direct appeal specifically invited audience members to not only consider becoming an organ donor, but to discuss organ donation and these end-of-life issues with their family members. And so we were interested in that outcome as well. And then across all of these, you know, does identification with the main character enhance those effects? So here we conducted a 2x2 experiment again. In this case, we looked at an episode of Grey's Anatomy that features an organ donation storyline, a pretty straightforward story that highlights the need for more organ donors and the shortage. And then combined with that, the presence or absence of this explicit persuasive appeal. And in this case, the appeal was a slightly different type. It was one that was delivered by Katherine Heigl, who's the actress that plays the main character most closely associated with the organ donation storyline in this episode. And it was in the format of sort of a brief news interview that followed the program, and she directly addresses the audience and asks them to consider becoming an organ donor. She talks about the importance of organ donation in the context of the story that was just shown, as well as in her own personal life. She has some experience with this issue. And then, as I said, makes this direct plea to please discuss this with your family. Okay. And I should say the control episode for the control condition was just another episode of Grey's Anatomy from that season. No organ donation storyline there. And so one of the things that came out of this study was that having that explicit appeal there, it didn't help, it didn't hinder the results. And so somewhat surprisingly, we found that it did not increase perceptions of persuasive intent. And I've found this across a couple of studies now, even those that use more traditional forms of explicit appeals, like a PSA at the end. It did not increase reactance. But it also didn't have any influence on attitudes or willingness to talk about organ donation with one's family at the post-test. So this is just the main effect of the PSA, or the explicit appeal. Did not affect any of these things. So in terms of those competing hypotheses, it looks like, okay, well, it didn't hurt things. It didn't arouse reactance or do some of those things that we might worry about. But it also didn't add any benefit above and beyond the narrative itself. The narrative did not have any influence on attitudes or willingness to engage in discussion at the immediate post-test. No effects. However, again, at the delayed post-test 2 weeks later, we see that those effects are there, such that exposure to the organ donation episode was associated with more favorable attitudes toward organ donation relative to the control. And so, again, we see this sort of delayed effect. Of the effects appearing after some time has gone by. And we were interested, as I said, in the role of identification in helping to explain or understand what these effects are all about. And so we had predicted that identification would operate in this manner. This is a moderated mediation model. And we expected that exposure to the organ donation episode would increase the perceptions that this is an important issue, or essentially issue involvement among viewers in that condition, but that it would do so if they really identified with Katherine Heigl's character in this case. Again, her character being the one that's intimately involved with the organ donation storyline, and also the one that makes the direct appeal and the explicit appeal condition. And what we found was that interaction reflected here on this side of the model was significant. And what exploring that interaction, what that showed us was that particularly at high levels of identification, when identification is high, we see this relationship is strongest, that between exposure to the episode and issue importance. But importantly, that's involvement with the issue at time 3, at the delayed follow-up. So again, we see this sort of slow process of identification with the character while viewing is associated with some increase in story personalization or importance over time. And then that was, issue importance was associated with more favorable attitudes at time 3 as well. We also found in this study a delayed effect in terms of willingness to discuss organ donation with one's family members. So again, this is another effect that did not appear at the post-test and does pop up 2 weeks later in the same manner. So looking across this study, we can draw a couple of main conclusions. Having an explicit appeal like this, it didn't help, but it didn't hurt either. But I think I don't want to overstate that particular finding, because I think there are still circumstances where it could help and circumstances where it could hurt. one of the things about this particular story is that it wasn't particularly ambiguous. And so it was a fairly clear takeaway that the story was communicating there's a shortage of available organs for donation, and we need more organ donors. So it might be the case that when you have a story that is more open for multiple interpretations, a message like this might be more useful in terms of serving that clarification function. I also think it's possible, that there are circumstances where it would increase perceptions of persuasive intent and reactance. And smoking-related behaviors is one of those areas where that may be the case. If it's a topic about which people have strong feelings or are likely toward reactance. And I think it's important to just draw out that, again, we see these kind of delayed effects with identification, again, leading to some internalization of the story over time so that we see effects increasing over time. Along the lines of this idea of discussing difficult to talk about issues, in the previous study I looked at that in terms of talking to one's family about organ donation. This particular study was designed to, again, look at identification and narrative persuasion, and to really zero in a little bit more on how people talk about difficult taboo topics. And so here, we were interested in how identification with a character might foster these kinds of conversations, in this case, in the context of sexual history, sexual health, and in particular, sexually transmitted infections. And so we were looking at this in that context. A little bit of background on that topic. We know that young adults tend to avoid these sorts of conversations in their sexual relationships. Tend to avoid asking about sexual history or sexual testing for STIs and things like that in their sexual relationships. And that in part this is because of low self-efficacy. And so it has to do with kind of not knowing how to bring the topic up, not having a lot of models for how to talk about this. And so they avoid these conversations for those reasons. And so the idea here was really based on sort of a simple Bandura type of argument that observing a model who is able to engage in these conversations and successfully navigate something that's difficult to talk about, that may lead to an increased willingness to have those conversations oneself. So Bandura with social cognitive theory and some research along those lines shows us that self-efficacy can be increased just by visualizing oneself engaging in a difficult task. So there are some studies in psychology that show that. And so if visualizing engaging in a difficult task increases self-efficacy, we can imagine that perspective taking or taking on the role of somebody else and kind of going along for the ride of that difficult task with them might similarly influence self-efficacy in the same way. So in this particular study, again, using sort of the same format of 3 waves of data collection, a pre-test, a post-test, and a delayed post-test. We had 3 different message conditions here using Sex and the City. And in the main treatment condition, the sexual discussion condition, viewers saw 2 different storylines that were edited together and kind of woven into one episode. And both of these stories dealt with sexually transmitted infections. So in one storyline, Miranda learns that she is that she has chlamydia, and she's shown having to share that information with her current sexual partner and call all her past sexual partners as well. And then in this storyline, another character, Samantha, is asked by a potential sexual partner if she's been tested for HIV. She has not, and so she goes to a clinic, discusses this with a doctor, and discusses it with friends. So we see sort of people talking about these issues in a variety of different contexts. In a control condition, viewers watch an episode of Sex and the City that does not address sexual health or STIs. And then in this middle condition, this no discussion condition, viewers saw an episode that has these storylines, but included them in a truncated way. And so Miranda learns that she has chlamydia, but we don't see her discussing it with anyone. Similarly, Samantha, this issue of whether she's been tested for HIV is raised, and then we don't see her engaging in any of those conversations with friends or doctors. And the idea behind that condition was to be able to really determine whether it's seeing people modeling these discussions that leads to potential persuasive effects versus just raising the issue in general, or just sort of a priming effect or a reminder effect. So that's why that second condition was important to include. So in this study, I think one of the most interesting findings has to do with measures of actual behavior 2 weeks after exposure. So 2 weeks after exposure to one of these 3 episodes, we asked participants a variety of questions about their conversations with potential sexual partners. And this is among those who were sexually active. So did you discuss STI testing with a partner? Did you discuss using condoms or other safe sex practices? Did you insist that a partner get tested? Or ask a partner if he or she has been tested? Insist on using a condom? Discuss the need for HIV testing. Okay, so questions like these. And then we looked at how prevalent these behaviors were, averaging these behaviors together, how prevalent were they across the different conditions. And we see that they were significantly more prevalent among those in the sexual discussion condition relative to the other 2 conditions, which didn't differ. Okay, so we can see that this sort of modeling of difficult conversations about a difficult topic increases actual behavior or actual conversations in the 2 weeks after exposure. And that happened only when the conversations were actually depicted and modeled, which lends some credibility to that idea that this is about providing social scripts and really increasing efficacy in that way, not just reminding people that this is a potential risk that's out there. We were also interested in this study in looking at, again, the mechanisms for this. And so we looked at the role of identification again in explaining this delayed effect. And so in particular, the kind of new layer that's added in this study above vulnerability and counter-arguing, which have been addressed in other studies, was this idea of self-efficacy. And we find that consistent with what Bandura would tell us, it is those individuals who identified with Miranda and Samantha, and we ran it with both characters. It didn't make a difference, but identification with those characters that engage in these difficult conversations is associated with greater self-efficacy. Self-efficacy was important for intentions. This is intentions to discuss, to have these kinds of conversations, and actual discussions in those 2 weeks following exposure. Identification in this study did also reduce counter-arguing in the ways that we would expect from a lot of these models. So the more I take on the perspective of that character, I'm less likely to generate counter-arguments. And this link with vulnerability in this particular study was not significant. And so identification was not associated with greater vulnerability to STIs. And I think that raises some interesting questions about kind of identifying with different types of characters. Characters who successfully navigate a particular situation versus characters who, who meet some negative consequences as a result of their behavior, and kind of how those might operate differently in terms of efficacy and vulnerability. But we can see here that that sort of cognitive rehearsal explanation of visualizing oneself engaging in a difficult behavior should increase self-efficacy in the ways that we would expect. So looking at this study, we can say, okay, narrative messages do seem to be able to prompt these health-related discussions. Identification seems to facilitate this in the way that we would expect. And across these 3 studies, we've seen this then in terms of sort of increasing self-efficacy, maybe reducing counter-arguing or increasing vulnerability, and that these are important ways that identification may lead to personalizing or internalizing this story in some manner. So in terms of those questions that I posed towards the beginning of our time together today, are narratives uniquely effective compared to other types of messages? We can certainly say that they seem to be processed in distinct ways, which we would expect. We can see that effects increase over time. That's not to say that that will always be the case, but that seems to be a growing finding, that we can demonstrate that that occurs lots of the time. In terms of the mechanisms, one thing that we know is really important is involvement with characters. In particular, identifying with the character can lead to internalizing those findings or that character's experiences, and that might be if the character experiences vulnerability, then I internalize that vulnerability and ruminate on that potentially over time. If the character is efficacious, then I might internalize that efficacy over time. And then I think these studies that I presented today, as well as some of the other work that's out there on narrative persuasion, keep sort of pointing to the role of discussion and how people talk about narratives and what the implications of that might be for narrative persuasion in general. We can see here from what I presented that certainly the narratives seem to prompt interpersonal discussion about the topics they're in. So we saw that in the STI study that I just presented from Sex and the City. Also, to some extent, maybe in the organ donation study where people expressed a greater willingness to discuss these topics. But some of what I've been thinking about recently has to do with in what ways might these conversations that people have, how might that actually moderate the way that a particular narrative is interpreted, as well as how future narratives might be understood and interpreted. Because in a lot of these studies, what I'm doing is I'm bringing people into a lab and I'm having them watch something in isolation. And that's not what they really do in their real lives. They watch with people, parents and children watch together, friends watch together, partners watch together, and they might talk about these things. And so trying to understand how those conversations actually moderate effects is one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about. And so moving beyond this idea that narratives are effective at prompting this sort of talk, how can we understand the nature of these conversations? And this is important, of course, sort of theoretically for our understanding of narrative persuasion, but it's also really important from a practical standpoint. We know that parents and children use television in this way. Parents and teens report that they do use topics that come up in the media as a way to kind of bring up things that they might want to talk about, so whether that's sexual health or some other risk behavior. And it perhaps provides a context for discussing things that's less threatening or is a little bit easier. Because I can discuss, sexual health and communicate something about my values without having to talk about, myself or my child. We can talk about this character that we saw. And so we know that this is a way that parents and children communicate. We also know that lots of campaigns target this outcome. So talk to your child about this important issue. And that's a tremendously important aspect of many campaigns. But we also know that in some cases, parents don't know how to effectively talk about risk-related issues with their children. And so depending on the manner in which they do that, it might be helpful or it could end up being counterproductive. So are there ways in which we can identify how to talk about these entertainment narratives in ways that foster effective pro-social outcomes? And so in my own work, what I've been trying to work on most recently is how to consider this narrative-related discussion more kind of fully. So moving beyond looking at communication about talking about these issues as a sort of yes or no outcome variable, which is most of what I've been doing. People either talked or they didn't. They talked about these topics or they did not. But trying to look at really sort of how the nature of the communication and think about how we can measure communication style, satisfaction with the communication, and how that might moderate the narrative persuasion experience itself. So I've been thinking about that in a couple of different contexts. These are studies that are in their very early stages, just getting ready for in the design phase. But one that I am working on is looking at the MTV program 16 and Pregnant, which depicts real teens who have encountered an unplanned pregnancy. And it's designed to communicate something about the difficulties of teen pregnancy. And early research on the effects of this particular show are somewhat mixed, with some research showing that it can be a really powerful way to communicate those dangers of teen, or the negative consequences of teen pregnancy, and other research showing that it might actually do the opposite, that it might highlight or underscore or present teen pregnancy in a way that appears as though the benefits outweigh the risks, or that highlight, kind of the unconditional love and joy that a baby might bring into your life. And so these unintended consequences have been documented as well. And some of the differences between these different studies that find different results has to do with whether or not people are talking about the findings. So in one of the studies that shows positive effects, it was when this show was used as part of a sort of media literacy lesson in a classroom type setting. And that was a circumstance where we see these kind of intended effects. And so I've been really curious about kind of how parents and teens, mothers and daughters, might talk about this program, and how different, how the presence or absence of this discussion might moderate the persuasive effects. And so that's one study that we're getting ready to do, looking at a sample of mothers and teens. And then another way that I'm interested in looking at this is with respect to the HPV vaccine. So another study that we're interested in, that we're getting ready to do, has to do with looking at how different narratives that are present in entertainment media can shape the way that parents talk to doctors, or parents think about talking to doctors about the HPV vaccine in terms of risks and benefits, and in terms of understanding it as cancer prevention versus sort of a safe sex issue and things of that nature. So that's the kind of things that I'm working on, again, building on this idea of how narratives may lead to interpersonal discussions about the stories that are contained therein. So I'm going to leave it there because I'm very eager to hear from you guys and to address some of your questions and comments. Again, thank you so much.
I'll start if nobody's going to raise their hand. So thank you very much for this. It's an interesting set of new studies that you're doing. I'm really interested in something we talked about this morning over breakfast, control groups.
Yeah.
And so I would, one of the things that I would raise to you is ask you the following questions about your comparison groups.
Sure.
To what extent are you convinced that you've got informational equivalence between your narrative exposures and your non-narrative or whatever the other exposures are? And secondly, to what extent are you convinced that you have what I would call priming equivalence? That is, that you've primed people to think about topic X in the control group, and then you've given them topic X in a narrative form in the narrative group. Mm-hmm. Because without those two, it seems to me, the research in the area could be based on informational differences, priming differences, and not narrative differences.
Great, thank you. Those are great questions. Some of those things, some of us were even talking about this morning in terms of questions about manipulating narrative. And so your first question about informational equivalency across the two conditions, I think, is certainly a challenge in this area. So some of the things in that first study that I showed you, what we did to get at that, we did some pre-testing with questions like, what is the main message from this, and we were able to show that the messages were equal on those things, but that doesn't address this concern entirely, and it doesn't, completely satisfy me that there couldn't be nuanced differences in the pure information across those two conditions. So I think that's a real concern. One of the things that some of us were talking about this morning in a meeting is this idea that there's a tension, I think, between, on the one hand, for tight experimental control, I want everything but one thing to be different between these two conditions. On the other hand, I think this idea of narrative and non-narrative, or high and low narrative, is in large part a sort of multi-dimensional thing that we're trying to manipulate. And so one, I think, can also go too far in the other direction of making them too similar, and then what's left doesn't really reflect a true narrative either. And so I am never sure that I've struck that balance perfectly. And the things that I think are most important is, aside from any individual study, if across work we can have some sort of triangulation around that by using different narratives and non-narrative groups, and by using different strategies. So what I've done and what I presented here is to use real existing media texts and to try to look at those. A way to look at this in a way that has a tighter experimental control is to, if I could create one's own narratives, maybe write a story with two different versions of a story, and some sort of hybrid versions of that, creating one's own television narrative and things like that. And I think, looking across some of that research can tell us, okay, if across these different studies we're seeing the same kinds of patterns, that's more convincing. But share some of your concerns about that. As far as your second question, to what extent, so you have a narrative about organ donation, and in the control condition, it's still a narrative, but it doesn't raise the issue of organ donation at all. So can we really say from that, I think those studies certainly don't show, so something like the organ donation study does not show that narrative is superior to a non-narrative. It might be the case that it's simply information. You could make that argument. I think the counter to that argument is that we can look at the mechanisms of how this is working, and it seems as though the mechanisms are operating in the ways that those features that are more prominent in narrative, that engagement, seems to be driving the effects. And so that to me is where a lot of times the interesting stuff lies, is in looking at how it works. And so I think that's of interest. But you're right, it doesn't tell us that informational PSA wouldn't have necessarily had the same effects. Yeah. Yes.
I really enjoyed your presentation. I was fascinated with the part about the identification. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me a little bit more about how you measure identification?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So I use Jonathan Cohen's measure of identification, which is a series of 10 items that basically measure the extent to which viewers put themselves in the shoes of the character. So it's items like, I could feel what the character felt. I wanted to, so like when bad things happen to the character, it made me feel bad. When good things happen, it made me feel good. Internalizing the perspective and the motivation. And so that's what that scale looks like.
Can I ask you a quick follow-up?
Sure.
And so do you account for any way in previous exposure to these shows? So, I was looking at the two examples with Sex and the City and Grey's Anatomy. I've never watched Sex and the City, so I haven't. Apparently I'm the only one. I'm your control group. So to get sort of this in a first exposure, if I'm coming into your lab, that's different than someone who knows that this person's character, and now and in a similar sense, I sit next to my wife while she watches Grey's Anatomy, mm-hmm. So I'm vaguely aware of the characters and stuff, but I wouldn't say, so I would identify with them, but maybe not in sort of a bonding sense. It's more like it's Thursday night, and I can't put hockey game on or something like that. So I'm coming to this from someone who studies smokers, and people have I'm not a smoker, and then you ask them how much they smoke, and they say, well, Thursday night when I'm out at bars, Friday, Saturday, and they're smoking 10 cigarettes a week, and they're not a smoker. So I'm just curious from that perspective how you deal with everything they've done in their life up until they show up in your lab, because I'm a lab person too.
Right.
So I'm really fascinated by the design that you have.
Yeah, it's an important question. I generally will will measure and control for familiarity with the show, familiarity with the episode, to try to get at a little bit of that. But what that doesn't do is it doesn't deal with all of the ways that people who choose to identify with this character versus those who don't might be different. And so that's an important question as well. Is looking at what are the factors that predict whether somebody identifies with a character in Sex and the City or not. I'll often check for certain key variables that I'm interested in. I want to know, is there past sexual history driving that, or things that are relevant to what I'm looking at. But it's a question that it hasn't really been satisfactorily answered yet in terms of what determines identification. We know a little bit. We know similarity is associated with it. We know a few things, but we don't know all of the either individual differences or message-related factors that might drive that. It's a great question. Yeah.
I really like those. I'm really I find this very appealing and exciting. And really in response to Joe, maybe the comparison between narrative and didactic is just pointless. Because in fact you can't ever, there's always the case category. Sometimes whatever you do doesn't represent all the possible. So the other focus of your work, which says, what about narrative matters? What produces discussion? Seems maybe a much more interesting question. And pushing aside that comparison. I realize once in a while a PSA has to decide whether to tell a story or be didactic, but Sex and the City never is going to be didactic.
Right.
They're never going to do that. So that's sort of uninteresting in that context. So I wonder whether it's even worth struggling towards having a pure control group that just has information, but really only think about, really as you have in part, is variation across narrative intensity.
Yeah, I think that is certainly appealing and interesting to look at. What are those message features? And then for me, increasingly also, what are these contextual features about the way in which we watch it, who we're watching with and how that plays a role as well. Yeah. Yes?
That links a little bit to what I was in the second study, where you was a bit surprised by not seeing an enhanced perceived persuasive effect with the PSAs.
Right.
I wondered about the show type and norms there, because you showed SVU and then Grey's Anatomy, and both of those are shows kind of that are a little bit preachy in that way, and they take on issues, right? It goes back to sort of ER and those sorts of shows, whereas a sitcom like Sex and the City probably isn't like that, although your issue with Sex and the City was a sex-related one, which is right there in the title. But do you think something like SVU, where every time there's a new issue or there's a terrorist attack or there's an immigration issue, somewhere soon you can expect that an issue is going to come up and it's going to be a morality tale of some kind?
Right. That's an interesting point. Yeah. We did a similar study with SVU, and in that study, there was a main effect of again, not the PSA, but the episode. So just the presence of that episode, the topic in the episode, increased perceived persuasive intent, which is consistent with your argument that, people might already be expecting that sort of preachiness in the episode, so that the PSA doesn't go over the threshold. The threshold's already been reached. That's possible. The other thing that you raise is the issue of, in a sitcom, there's the whole issue of humor, too, which is another can of worms. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, you use all this positive message in your studies. Would you expect all the conclusions will apply if you use a very negative context, like this identification or delayed effect? Would they still apply when you expose them to some negative content, like the violence?
Okay. Certainly, yeah. I think there's research that would support that notion that identifying with a violent character would increase potentially the effects of of some antisocial or negative content as well. Yeah, I think identifying with a character is likely to increase effects of all different kinds. And what I've been trying to carve out is to really figure out, why is that? What is it about identification? What is that doing? And so trying to hone in on what those mechanisms might be. Is it vulnerability or self-efficacy, or kind of how does that work? But so I think, yeah, that could certainly apply in that context too.
Well, I'm sure that there are other questions. We should probably adjourn so that people can get off to the next line of things that they have to do. These opportunities are wonderful because we get to learn a lot about our speaker and what the speaker is doing. We get to learn that Dr. Strasser is not interested in sex, not interested in health, but is deeply interested in violence. But we learn much more important things from our speakers, and Emily, thank you very, very much.